this microphone is supposed to be here for the overhead. That goes to this one. Yeah. So, just a quick explanation on what we did with the questions. We compiled them, and obviously there was some repetition. So, this morning Steve Shalom and I kind of went through them, and we pulled out the repetition and we organized them in some kind of flow that made sense. And slightly edited some just to give some segue to others and whatnot. And we try to include just about everything. We might not get to everything, of course, but we've got the 2 rounds before and after lunch sessions, so we'll just see what happens and hope to best capture the questions that you have for Noam. Let me turn this on.
Does this work?
Yeah, I just have to turn it on. Should get some audio.
Is this working?
Yeah.
You can hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, first thing is everything that Mike said was a lie. I cleared the floor.
So, to begin with, can you hear me okay? Is this
Yes.
fine? Okay. To begin with, what is the left? What kind of language can we use to describe our movement and positions that actually mean something to us and others?
The left is the movement that's in favor of all decent things. Freedom, justice.
He's got.
Can't hear?
Well, you know, it's always the case now.
I can turn you up a little bit too.
Why don't I hold it?
Okay, if you want. Here we go. Okay.
Sorry, I kind of been talking just back from a couple of long trips and I totally lost my voice. So what's the left? We, of course, have to define it for ourselves, but traditionally it's the movement that's been in favor of more freedom, more justice, more equality, more participation, more control of our own lives, peace, in fact, all decent things. That's the left. How can you present it to people? Honestly. Just take issues, there's no point formulating abstractions. Anybody can say those words. Hitler can say them. What you have to show is you mean them by the particular way in which you apply them to the problems that people face and have. But the drive to pursue those objectives, I think that's what's always animated the left. Nothing very profound about it.
So switching to more some current events, the change that many voters hoped for would come in this country when Barack Obama was elected has yet to happen. What went wrong?
What went wrong was the hope. There was never any reason for it. And you can't blame him. If you read his website or you listened to you found what limited content there was in what he was saying, he presented himself as a normal centrist Democrat, not very different from, in international affairs, not very different from Bush's second term, very hawkish. There was just nothing there. I mean, I wrote about him before the election, before the primaries even, just using his website. And it was perfectly transparent. If people wanted to be deluded, they had that choice, of course. But, I don't usually agree with Sarah Palin, but when she asks what's happened to that hopey-changey business, she's exactly right. Nothing happened, and there was no reason to expect anything to happen. He was a creature of the financial institutions. They preferred him to McCain. The core of his funding was financial institutions and law firms, which doesn't mean civil rights lawyers, it means lobbyists. And they expected to be paid back. That's the way American politics works. And they were paid back. with a huge bailout. They're richer and better off than before. And there's very little in it to be surprising. So the question is, what do you do? I mean, this happened before. There was, history doesn't repeat exactly, but analogy is close enough to pay some attention to. If you go back to 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected with similar illusions. A lot of glitz, a lot of glamour, and Camelot this, and so on and so forth. And it did elicit a lot of enthusiasm among young people who thought, okay, the world's going to change after these stodgy, terrible Eisenhower years. Well, it didn't take long for Kennedy to, for the illusions to be shed by Kennedy's actions. And what was interesting was how people reacted. They didn't react by saying, okay, we give up, the illusions are gone. They reacted by deep engagement in activism. And that led to the activism of the 60s, which had plenty of outgrowths like this, for example, and many others. And I think the serious question now is how people who were misleadingly, who were misled by the illusions created around the Obama presidency, how they'll react. Two choices: react by saying, well, no hope, let's give up, we'll go to our private lives, or saying, okay, we were misled, now we're going to really pursue the illusions that were shattered, that were the right ones. And you can have another period of activism and significant change. But I think that's really in the hands of the people who believe who were caught up in the wave of enthusiasm. Mistakenly, but you can make mistakes and you can look back and say, how do we go on from here?
Do you have any strategic advice on how
No.
the...
Or tactical advice.
on how the left can better organize the legitimate popular grievances the right so successfully preys upon?
Well, there are things that can be done. I mean, it depends who you are and where you are. Like, I'm not going to organize steel workers. I'm not a steel worker. But in our own communities, we can do a lot of things. And they range from it's across the board. You just take, say, health reform, where it's a very serious issue. Let's start with the deficit. We're supposed to be, the propaganda today is we've got this hideous deficit, we have to concentrate attention on getting rid of it, everything else has to go. Well, first of all, it doesn't make a lot of sense economically. In a recession, you want to have a deficit. You want to have a stimulus. That's how you grow your way out of economic recession. 17 million unemployed, and you get back to economic growth and you overcome the deficit. But putting that aside, what's the deficit? Well, if you listen to NPR, the deficit is Social Security and Medicare. But that's only because the rich and privileged have been trying for years to destroy them. Social Security isn't in any kind of trouble. Medicare is in trouble, but because it's linked to the privatized health system, which is in serious trouble. Take a look at the deficit. About half of it is military spending, which is going up under Obama. In fact, it's reaching new heights, and it's and nobody's talking about cutting that. So when people talk about cutting the deficit, you know right away they're not serious. The other half is pretty much medical costs. Maybe not right now, but we project it'll be the growing medical costs in the completely dysfunctional healthcare system are going to overwhelm the federal budget, which is not bad for the Peterson Institute and NPR and the right wing and so on, because they're just as happy to have the benefit systems cut. The rich will still get what they want. We already have health system that essentially is rationed by wealth, and if it gets even more so, you're not going to get any complaints from wealth and privilege. But here are easy issues that are easy to organize about. We have, it's true, there's a deficit. How serious it is, you could argue about, but it's there. So let's, riding the wave of concern about the deficit, let's look at what it comes from. I mean, do we have to spend as much as the rest of the world combined on military force, technologically far more advanced, hundreds of military bases all over the world? I don't think anybody's calculated it, but if you simply looked at the costs of the prepositioned weapons around the world and the navies that the U.S. has scattered around the world doing nothing, just getting ready in case they're ever needed to use those prepositioned weapons for aggression wherever it may be, anywhere in the world, just calculate those costs. It would be astronomical. Do we need that? Is that good for us? Is it good for the world? Is it good for us to be working on advanced drone techniques with using nanotechnology? This is on the DARPA drawing boards, where you can get miniaturized drones that can find their way into a person's living room to kill a particular person who's under surveillance, and then all the way up to massive ones that carry out huge crimes. Is that what we need? I mean, is that what's good for the country or for the world, and so on? Plenty to organize on about that, and none of that's being discussed in the public arena. Take all the talk about the deficit. Again, I happened to listen to NPR on the deficit a couple of weeks ago. They had their talk program. They had one talk program a week, and they had two experts, both of them deficit hawks. Their only suggestion for dealing with the deficit was to cut Social Security and medical benefits. That's from the so-called left. Not a word about the military budget, not a word about why the healthcare costs are going out of sight. The healthcare reform is opposed by probably 2/3 of the population. But if you take a look at the polls, a very large part of that, maybe a majority, is because it didn't go far enough. It gave everything away. Okay, you can appeal to the people who have that position and explain to others that they're supporting a healthcare system that is about twice the per capita costs of the rest of the world, of other industrial countries, and has about the worst outcomes. For example, you can bring to light something that the press hasn't covered, an Amnesty International report studying maternal death around the world, death in childbirth. The United States is way at the top of the list. I think it's 5 times as high as Greece or something like that. It's just kind of outlandish. These and other studies comparing comparative health costs found, for example, that in Cuba, which is a poor country under attack for 50 years by the world's greatest superpower, health outcomes are about the same as the U.S. Expenses are 5% of the U.S. expenses. And the reason is that it's focused on preventive care. Clinics all over the place, doctors, mostly women, who, say for maternity, not only do they give prenatal care, but the doctor will go visit the mother and the baby in the home, make sure everything's okay, and that sort of thing. I mean, that's kind of taken for granted. All right, so for 1/20th of the cost, they get about the same outcomes we do. I mean, these are these two issues, the two issues that are causing the huge deficit, not so huge, but the large deficit, military and health. Yeah, those should be easy things to organize about, and they lead in all kind of directions. Now, if you're somewhere else, like if you happen to be living in central Michigan, you can be organizing about quite different things. So, for example, takes the government now pretty much owns much of the auto industry, and it's following the path of state corporate system for the last 30 years at transferring industrial production abroad. It's not closing down industrial production, it's just continuing the process that actually began around here, you know, center of the Industrial Revolution. Then you get cheaper labor, worse conditions in the South, so you move there. Then you go to the Southwest and you move there. Okay, in recent years you go overseas. You go to Mexico and China and Vietnam and so on. So the production is still there, and the profits are still here, and the banks like it, and the managers and owners like it, but it's destroying the society. I mean, when you close down an auto plant, you're destroying not only the workforce, but the community. Communities are usually built around the industrial plants. Do they have to be closed? Well, there's plenty of things that are needed here. In fact, I've mentioned this a couple of times, maybe you've heard me say it, that at the same time that Obama is closing down GM plants, he sent his Secretary of Transportation, Roy LaHood, to Europe to get contracts using federal stimulus money, taxpayer money, get contracts with mainly Spanish, but also other industrial firms in Europe to build high-speed rail transport, which we badly need here, and which could be produced in those closed-down plants. I mean, yesterday I came back from talks in New York, and I took the train, the fancy train, you know, the Acela, hyper expensive. And I happened to have been in Germany not long before and took a train. I mean, you can't begin to compare them. On the Acela, you can sort of read, if you don't mind being bumped around a lot, but trying to write is almost impossible. My wife and I took the train to New York the first time in around 1950. It then was 3 hours and 45 minutes, and now they've got it down to 3 hours, 3.5 hours if you pay a couple $100. If it was in Europe or Japan or practically in China, almost anywhere, it'd probably be an hour, it would be comfortable and so on. Well, you know, all of that can be built. I mean, it's not just an accidental, something that happened by accident. That's careful state corporate planning to design a particular kind of society that's highly wasteful in fossil fuel, that scatters people, that breaks down cities and so on, goes back to the 1940s. And it's led to a situation that's pretty harmful for everybody, except the rich, very rich. And it even harms them. They have to take the Acela too. But I mean, you can go first class, but you know, so you get which actually somebody got me a ticket for once, so I took it. It's exactly like coach, except that it's a caricature of the late 19th century in the Pullman trains. So there's a black porter who wears a white jacket and is very polite and helps you on board. And then there's a black maid who comes and puts a tablecloth on your table and serves you something or other. Other than that, it's like it's like my coach. But here's kind of an obvious. What's the obvious strategy in this case? Well, the obvious strategy is for working people to take over the factories and take them over, run them, manage them, produce the high-speed rail equipment or whatever else is needed and badly needed in society. It's not such a radical step. It's the kind of thing that's just below the surface in American history. And for example, you go back to the 1930s, the major New Deal reforms were instituted when the business classes really got frightened. And they got frightened by sit-down strikes. Sit-down strikes are just, you know, one thought away from taking over the factory and running it yourself and kicking out the bosses, and that was scary. So, you know, changes came. Pretty much like what's happening in China now. In China, working conditions are utterly miserable, and wages have been declining relative to GDP for the last couple of years. There's now a wave of strikes, as you've been reading on the front pages, in the foreign-owned plants. Most of the high technology and advanced production in China is foreign-owned. China itself is mostly an assembly plant. But But the strikes and first of all, a lot of suicides in the plants, and then it led to strikes, and now the Taiwanese and Japanese owners are being compelled to improve working conditions and wages. And if it goes beyond that to take over the plants, then they really get scared, and you get large-scale measures like the New Deal measures. Well, all of that is possible strategy. In fact, even tactics. Not for me, like I'm not working in Detroit, but for people who are in any similar, it could be a Starbucks store. Anyone who's in that environment, there are plenty of things you can do. And for the rest of us, those people like me, say, there's these large-scale issues. And there are even bigger ones than that. I mean, we are, after all, facing two crises which literally have to do with survival of the species. One of them is nuclear weapons. It's a problem that's getting worse. Another has to do with destruction of the environment, which is very serious, and is going to get a lot worse. There's plenty to do about that. And there's plenty of organizing possibilities. So just keep to the front pages. It always gives you opportunities. Well, right now there's a lot of concern about BP and the Gulf. Well, there's a number of things to say about that. One thing is that bad as this catastrophe is, it's not so substantial by global standards. I mean, what goes on in the Niger Delta, Nigeria, is incomparably worse. It's been going on for decades. Oil companies just destroying the place. Huge oil spills. But there are black people who are getting killed. So, who cares? Doesn't even make the newspapers. In fact, what's going on in Ecuador, in Amazonia, is worse than this, with the oil spills that are destroying parts of the Amazon and the indigenous communities. I mean, now it's hit here to the wealthy people, so of course it makes the front pages. But that gives an opening for lots of discussions. And what's happening right here is in substantial part traceable to the collapse of the regulatory apparatus under the neoliberal fanaticism of the last generation, which is pretty much the same as what led to the financial crises. I mean, there weren't any financial crises from the 1930s until the 1970s because the regulatory system was in place and the financial system was more or less state regulated. But with the explosion of finance and the elimination of regulation, you get repeated crises, getting worse and worse. We're now building up to the next one. And the same is true of the environmental crisis. Well, all of these things are, there's so many things that you can organize about that it's kind of almost pointless to mention them. You just stick a pin at random in almost anything in people's lives. And there's an issue there that requires work. It can be a simple issue. So a lot of organizing starts with things like, say, getting people in a poor neighborhood together to get the city council to put a traffic light on a street where kids have to go to school. And if people can achieve that, they can learn that you can achieve something. And then they go on to the next thing. And there are groups that do it, and do it pretty well. Right here in Boston, for example, there's, just to show you how atomized the society is, I didn't even know anything about it, though I've been living here most of my life. But there's a very good group in downtown Boston, Vita Urbana, which has been doing things exactly like this, very successfully, for I think about 35 years, in poor neighborhoods, mostly immigrant neighborhoods. They meet in a place called English High School, which is called that because nobody in sight speaks English, I think, anything but. But I happen to go to a meeting, listen to the things they're doing. It's pretty impressive. And it does go from simple things like let's get a traffic light to empowerment to looking for bigger things like let's do something about schools and drug problems and on and on. Those are things you can organize about. And that's the mission of the left. It's not hard to find.
considering the general exploitation of homophobia by the right, how can we as activists, leftists, or generally conscious citizens advocate for lesbian, gay, bi, and transsexual queer people in America and abroad?
Just the way it's been done for a couple of decades now, pretty successfully. There are some pretty striking changes in the last years. We should pay attention to them. So take, not just in the United States, but worldwide. I'll take a dramatic case. One of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, Alan Turing, who's famous for having developed a lot of the mathematical theories that led to modern computation and so on. He also happened to be one of the people who saved England during the Second World War. He was in the lead and among the mathematicians who cracked the German codes. So he's a major figure in England. He was murdered by Britain in the early 1950s. He was homosexual. They regarded it as a disease, and he was subjected to some curious kind of treatment which killed him. I mean, that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. Okay, that's pretty significant. And how did it happen? Well, we all know how, by education, by organizing, by activism. It has to be done in a way which doesn't frighten people and appeal to their, sort of elicit their worst emotions and reaction. So you don't want to kind of brazenly flaunt in front of people your attacks on their values. You have to help them come to understand that their values include tolerance and acceptance. And it's hard work, no special strategy that I've ever heard of. Just keep at it, and it makes changes. It's very substantial changes all through a large part of the world, right in our own lifetimes.
What forms of resistance can help us stop the racism and anti-immigrant sentiment that seems to be growing?
Well, first of all, you have to understand it. I mean, the people who are, the anti-immigrant sentiment is extraordinary. Just take a look at the elections yesterday in Europe. In Holland, which has been a very tolerant society for hundreds of years. Back in the 17th century, people from France and England were fleeing to Holland because they had some sort of freedom there. In Holland, there was a very high vote for an extreme right-wing, anti-immigrant racist, anti-Muslim racist, who's a real neo-Nazi. I mean, among his programs are what he calls, what does he call it? I think a raghead tax or something like that for women who wear veils. They have to pay a rag tax, things like that. A really vile, racist, anti-Muslim sentiment. And he's got a lot of support. In England, just yesterday, the new Conservative government passed a law, or introduced a law that requires that the spouse, an immigrant spouse, can be admitted to England only if he or she speaks English. It's kind of unbelievable in a civilized country. Aside from the idiocy, the place to learn English is in England, not in a second language school in Africa or someplace. But apart from the idiocy, the racism is extreme, and it's very strong here, and kind of understandable. People have the feeling that they, are taking everything away from us. I mean, we work hard. We're Christians. We're white. We've worked hard to achieve what we have, and now they are taking it all away from us. Who are they? Well, they are the illegal immigrants. Just like in, Germany in the late 20s and early 30s, the Jews and the Bolsheviks were taking it away from us. So we got to do something about it, and it didn't turn out very pretty. But the feelings are genuine, and the feelings have to be dealt with. and have to be dealt with by partly just explaining what the facts are. First of all, why are immigrants coming from Africa to Europe instead of going the other way around? Why are they coming from Mexico and Guatemala instead of people here going there? Actually, people here do go there, mainly rich people who buy land in Costa Rica to retire. But apart from that, why is the wave of immigration south to north? Well, people don't understand that, because the sources of that have also harmed them, apart from the fact that they've been involved in criminal acts, which they should also understand. So take, say, the immigration from Mexico and Central America to the United States. What's the source of it? Well, from Central America, the source is Reagan's terrorist wars. Tore the countries to shreds. In some places, like the Mayan areas in Guatemala, there was literal genocide in the 1980s. In fact, they're kind of unseen because undocumented aliens kind of keep quiet. They may clean your homes and cut your lawns and do the construction work and so on, but they try to keep them visible. But right around Boston, in northeast of Boston and all through Rhode Island, there's a pretty big Mayan community. People who've just fled from the virtual genocide in the Guatemalan highlands that the U.S. was supporting in the 1980s. Well, something people should know. It's not just that these people are coming here because they're trying to steal from us. We destroyed their lives. In fact, we slaughtered them. Okay, the remnants are trying to get away from it. Latin America altogether has had a horrible history of repression and violence. Two sources. One is Western imperialism last century. It's mostly us. The other is their own elites, mostly Europeanized white elites, which are vicious and brutal and savage. And between those two kind of hammers, they've been crushed. And the countries are now very poor. If you look at how they're doing a little better now, but a large part of their improvement now is just coming from remittances. In fact, remittances to Latin America are at about the level of, they're more than foreign aid, and about the level of foreign direct investment. They survive on that basis. Well, it's again the result of histories of centuries of violence and oppression. Let's turn to Mexico. It's a pretty striking case. You may have just read the paper this morning coming down here that yesterday a 15-year-old boy was murdered by a U.S. Border Patrol agent in Mexico. Crossed over into Mexico and killed this 15-year-old kid. And it ended up with the Mexican Army and the U.S. Border Patrol, aiming rifles at each other. Where would the but it's very brutal. Even apart, the people who are coming across, I happen to know somebody, just personally, I won't go into the details, that the woman who's just gave birth to a baby a couple of weeks ago. She, in the last year, she's Mayan, fleeing from the Mayan areas. She crossed the border 8 times in the last year. Most of the period when she was pregnant, never had any prenatal care or anything like that. And she was caught and sent back. The 8th time she finally made it, thanks to the work of very courageous solidarity workers in Arizona, mostly young people who leave bottles of water in the desert. And people kind of get through the 30 miles of desert that they have to go through, which is a murderous experience. If they survive it and aren't caught by the border police, the Solidarity activists help them get out of the area and so on. So she made it on her 8th try. It's now okay, just had her baby. But why are, she happens to be Mayan, but a lot of them are Mexican. But why are the Mexicans coming? Well, there's something called NAFTA, which was established in 1994 by the liberals. It was rammed through over the opposition of the American public and the Mexicans and the Canadians. The media, there were alternative programs proposed by the labor movement, Congress's Research Bureau, and so on. The media wouldn't even report on this long story. But Clinton managed to ram through the executive version of NAFTA. And if you look at the background, it's pretty clear what it was about. I'll go into that in a minute if you're interested. But the point is that when NAFTA was established, it was understood that it's going to destroy Mexican agriculture and Mexican business. Mexican agriculture cannot compete with U.S. agribusiness, which is massively state subsidized, thanks in large part to Reagan. The free market talk was rhetoric, but meanwhile the huge subsidies to agribusiness. And Mexican corn farmers and so on aren't going to be able to compete with it. So of course, if they're forced to accept imports from highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness, it's going to wipe out the agricultural system. Mexican businesses can't compete with U.S. multinationals, also massively government subsidized, quite apart from scale, which have to get national treatment in Mexico. They have to be treated like Mexican businesses under NAFTA. So of course it's going to devastate the Mexican economy and people are going to flee. Well, where are they going to flee? Well, they're not going to flee to Guatemala, so they're going to flee to the United States. So what do you do about it? Well, Clinton understood exactly what to do about it. The border between Mexico and the United States had been a pretty open border. It was established, of course, by conquest, and pretty much the same people lived on both sides. So people would cross the border to, visit their cousins or go to a party or something like that. In 1994, the same year NAFTA was passed, Clinton initiated the militarization of the border, Operation Gatekeeper. Why? Well, anybody could see that the impact of NAFTA, which is going to be harmful to American workers too, as it was, is also going to lead to a flow of immigrants. So you got to stop them by force. And then you get yesterday when a border guard kills a kid in Mexico, or the young woman I was talking about who managed somehow to make it 8 tons and have a baby here finally. Well, that's the immigrant issue. These are the bases of it. And in fact, the fact of the matter is the immigrants contribute to the American economy. When an immigrant comes in, it leads to economic growth. For one thing, they're treated horribly. They're all over the place. They're doing all the dirty work, a lot of the dirty work in the society, whether it's cleaning homes or cutting lawns or construction work or whatever, and doing it at horrible wages and working conditions. They can't complain about it because, for obvious reasons, they're undocumented, so they're easily exploitable. But they send back remittances, but they also spend money that leads to businesses developing, economic growth, and so on. So their net effect, just from a pure economic point of view, is beneficial to the economy and even to the people who's. It's not really that they're threatening jobs; they're taking jobs that American workers don't want to take. They don't want to work under those conditions, rightly. But this is a whole mass of issues that can be discussed to deal with the anti-immigrant hysteria, but it has to begin by recognizing that it does have legitimate roots. People feel threatened, seriously threatened. Their way of life is being taken away from them. It's just not being taken away from them by immigrants. It's being taken away from them by Goldman Sachs executives. And they got to understand that. That takes some work. That's what organizing's about. Taking the legitimate grievances that people have, recognizing their legitimacy. The same is true on homophobia. Recognize legitimacy and come to terms with it. Get people to help people try to understand what the sources and causes are, and what it reveals about themselves, their own internal problems that they ought to face, but also what reveals about the society in which they live and the propaganda to which they're being subjected. But, that's the work of leftist organizing. But the problem is serious. It's not the United States, it's worldwide. Europe, it happens to be Turks and Muslims and Africans. But in the United States, it's people coming from the wreckage we've created in Latin America. And all of those are things to be seriously confronted sympathetically, but without giving an inch on the real issues.
It's currently 12, so I'm thinking we'll just ask one more question, and then we can take the break for lunch and come back and continue afterwards.
Okay. Ask me later about the background to the Mexico thing. It's kind of interesting.
Given,
never appear in the press, anyway, of course.
So shifting focuses somewhat, given that Great Britain was always able to rule some of its colonies with minimal presence on the ground in terms of colonial staff, what are the prospects for Iraqi sovereignty? Should we expect indirect rule in Iraq?
Well, it depends on two factors, primarily Iraqis and secondarily us. What happened in Iraq is extremely interesting. Maybe if there's more time later, I'd like to talk about it, but I think what happened in Iraq is that the United States was actually defeated. It was quite unusual. For example, in Vietnam, which was called a defeat, I think was actually a victory when you look at the actual war aims. But Iraq, if you look at the war aims, was defeat, a serious defeat. And the main factor in it was nonviolent resistance. The U.S. was able to kill insurgents. We were really good at killing people. Got a massive murder machine. But they could not deal with hundreds of thousands of people in the streets demanding elections, which the U.S. tried in every way to block. Contrary to the headlines, the U.S. was desperately trying to prevent any form of democracy in Iraq, but they couldn't block it. Step by step, the U.S. had to back off. Finally, again, you really have to search to get the data, but they're important. It's important. I mean, as late as January 2008, the official U.S. government position, stated by the president, was that the U.S. was committed to ensuring that there would be permanent U.S. military bases in Iraq, permanent options for U.S. military actions in Iraq, and privileged access for U.S. corporations to Iraqi oil. Now that was always in the background, but in the early stages of the war it was kind of hidden under the usual boilerplate of democracy and all the other things. But as the situation got more and more desperate for the U.S., they had to come out with the truth. And by late 2007, early 2008, if you look closely, the official pronouncements were giving the truth. In fact, they were saying exactly what the left had been saying all along, that the goal of the war was to establish a U.S. client state with a major U.S. military presence, or to be in position to dominate the region, and of course to control the energy resources and make sure U.S. corporations had privileged access to them. Now, if you said that through the years of the war, you were considered kind of an anti-American lunatic coming from Mars. But finally, by 2008, they had to concede it publicly, officially. Yes, those were the war aims. And they had to give them up, formally at least. You take a look at the Status of Forces Agreement, the U.S. had to give up on every one of those points. Just as it had to step back year after year from its efforts to prevent any form of democracy and national representation of Iraqi democracy, nationalism. Just had to back off. It's a major defeat. In fact, one of the main books on the war by a very good British analyst, journalist, Jonathan Steele, first rate, it's called Defeat. It's just the history of the U.S. defeat in Iraq. Well, what happens from now on? Well, it depends whether the Iraqis can continue that process. But there's something for us to learn, too. Why was the U.S. forced to back off? Well, the primary reason was Iraqi resistance, nonviolent resistance, a major triumph for nonviolence. But there's a secondary reason, which is right here. The U.S. population would not tolerate the war. U.S. opposition, constantly, it's kind of a principle. If you read something, if something is conventionally believed, you can pretty well take for granted it's false, and the opposite is true. And it's commonly, it's commonly argued across the spectrum that there was no opposition to the war in Iraq, and people, lament how come it wasn't like Vietnam, where we had this huge opposition, but in Iraq somehow there was no opposition. It's exactly the opposite. You take the Vietnam War at any point where it was at the same stage as the Iraq War, and there was no opposition at all. Not only no opposition, but efforts to express opposition were repressed pretty violently, like right here in Boston, for example. Some people here are old enough to remember that in October 1965, after 3 years of war in Vietnam, a couple 100,000 American troops there, South Vietnam practically destroyed. And we tried to have our first anti-war demonstration, public one, on the Boston Common, which is the sort of main place for public demonstrations. So there was a small march from Harvard Square to the Boston Common, maybe a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand people at the Boston Common. And there was supposed to be talks. Actually, I was supposed to be one of the speakers. It was broken up by students, violently broken up by students. Couldn't hear a word. The only reason people weren't slaughtered was a couple hundred state policemen there. The next day, the Boston Globe, a liberal newspaper, you probably pick it up on the internet, great applause for the counter-demonstrators. Big picture of the wounded war veteran on the front page, and denunciation of these hideous counter-demonstrators who were asking for things so mild that it was embarrassing. We couldn't even talk about stopping the war in South Vietnam. Instead of talking about maybe stop the bombing of the North or something like that, it's kind of a sideshow. Well, that was 1965. The Iraq War never even got to that stage. But the effects of the anti-war movement in the 60s, and the expansion of the same popular movements later in many ways, led to a situation where the public simply would not tolerate the measures that were undertaken in South Vietnam. So Kennedy and Johnson had no problem authorizing napalm, B-52 saturation bombing, driving millions of people into concentration camps, whatever they wanted to do, chemical warfare, no protest. They couldn't do that in Iraq. In fact, they never got near it. You can tell it by the casualty figures. The U.S. casualty figures in Iraq are around 4,000. In Vietnam, it was like 60,000. And the troop levels are the same. So they couldn't get anywhere near it, and they were hampered by resistance at home. And a combination of resistance at home and primarily massive resistance in Iraq led to an American defeat. Okay, so back to the question, where does it go from here? Depends how these factors project into the future. We can do something about the ones here. The ones there are their problem. But it's not going to be easy, certainly. Iraq was practically destroyed. It was nothing like Vietnam. It was totally wiped out. But Iraq suffered a very serious blow in every respect. It's left with one effect of the invasion was to elicit sectarian conflicts, which had really not existed in the past. As late as about 2005, the Iraqis were saying that there won't ever be sectarian conflicts. We're all intermarried, we live together, and so on and so forth. But when it finally blew up, it got very ugly, as these things do. It's now a rift right through the Middle East. The U.S. war has created major sectarian conflict through Sunni Shia sectarian conflict through the Middle East, which is threatening to tear the region apart. Those are all big effects. They're problems so serious that they just keep being put off because nobody can dream of how to resolve them, like the state of Kirkuk, which is claimed both by Kurds and Arabs. So they got plenty of problems inside, but maybe they can deal with them somehow. And we can do what we can to prevent a colonial administration from being established, to force the U.S. government to live up to what it's formally agreed to in the Status of Forces Agreement. It's not going to be easy. Obama certainly isn't planning to do it. If you notice that nobody's talking about what's happening to the military bases, so it's pretty hard to find out. There's huge military bases all over the country. I know that they're being taken care of by contractors. The U.S. has sort of farmed out a lot of its military work to private mercenary corporations. And the contractor, I just spoke to a journalist friend of mine who knows the head of the big contracting agency, and he says they're continuing to build the military bases. What's being planned, you have to go to the Obama cabinet to find out, and they're not telling you. We do know that Obama is expanding the city in Baghdad that's called an embassy. It's actually a city. It's a huge construction, kind of small city inside Baghdad, about the size of the Vatican, which was running at about $1.5 billion a year. Obama's increased it to $1.8 billion for this year. It'll probably go up beyond that, which of course is nothing like any embassy in the world, except for the ones that Obama's building in Islamabad and Kabul, which also tells you what the intentions are. But that means the intention is to try to somehow reverse the defeat. We're not going to give up easily, but how this will pan out depends in large measure on us. Do we want to spend billions of dollars a year to build cities in Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan to ensure that we can control the region, along with military bases and torture chambers and so on? I mean, that's our choice. That's something else that has to do with this first question about the deficit.
So we do have some questions from the groups about anti-war resistance and the difference between Vietnam in the 60s, anti-war resistance then, and resistance to the occupation of Iraq today, and especially under Obama. So we'll go have lunch. We'll ask these questions when we get back, and we'll pick up right back up where we left off.
Chris, could we have volume on this side up a little bit for Chomsky? Yes. Is that okay? It's a little bit low. It was fine, but it's just.
Would it be okay if we moved one of these ladies kind of? Okay.
I'm ripping the video from before and we'll upload it. Yeah, I asked Lydia and the guys. No, I asked them. I did respect intellectual property.
I'll be brave.
Oh yeah, I'll take that. Thank you.
As long as you're offering. Appreciate it.
Chris, is it okay?
Yeah, you can smell it, the wonderful artificial.
If you're the infiltrator, you're way up there.
Is that a 15 inch?
Sorry?
Have what's the screen size?
Okay. I'm just giving you a cue when you're ready.
Yeah, I want to get it. No problem. They have like 13, 15, 17
Yeah, I wouldn't have any way of knowing if
Can I have your attention for just a second? Because we started late, we consulted with those of us doing classes at the 3:30 slot. I'm one of them. And if you don't mind, we will extend this session till 4, and then those sessions will have.
We second that.
Excuse me, don't interrupt me. So those sessions will be an hour and a half starting at 4. They'll go into the social hour, and you can choose to go to those classes. But if you're going to do something else besides those classes, don't gather at the Z House because it'll interfere with those classes. Don't gather. The dining hall opens at 5:30, etc.
We're actually extending this to 3:30, and the other one starts at 4.
Right. Implied. Did you want to say something, my sweet one?
I second that. I think it's a good idea.
All right, so are we clear? Is this okay with you? Because we can always cut it all short, and... I'm kidding.
Well, the social hour, well, because we're supposed to meet with our project groups at that time. Is it going to be cut short?
We've arranged meetings. It's not an assigned project group time.
It's not?
No. I mean, which doesn't mean you won't have one. Check the schedule and see where the classes are at the house at that time, and maybe there's a room that you can use. Otherwise, meander over to Swope, because it opens at 5:30. You can meet at those tables forever.
One other thing, at dinner, not that it's rock star time, but still, the lunch was very good, but there were about 20 men at the table with Noam. So the rule at dinner is any women who want to sit at the table, if there's any seats left, the guy can sit there, and if there weren't too late.
No faculty at the table.
I second that as well.
There's a bunch of people in yeah. I interviewed you at MIT at your office for people's movements and MIT says you only watch one movie a year, but I finally just was wondering if you might be interested in watching it sometime. Like get you a copy. It's done. Yeah. It's not about you, but you're in it for a little.
Lydia's
Yeah.
not in the camera.
Lydia's not in the camera. Pressure, but I think you'd like it a lot because it shows movements all over the world. Yeah. Thanks for being here.
Rather bother you now than while you're eating.
One actually, we're just trying to get people together to get started, so a little later. Can you hear me? Check. Are we ready? Okay, we're going to get started right away, sir. Yes, I will. Okay. Give me a thumbs up when you're ready, camera crew. Are you?
I'm recording.
Okay. Okay, so here we are with round 2. Hope everybody had a good lunch. Good. And there was an announcement earlier about the slight time schedule change. If you didn't hear it because you're outside, ask somebody else at some point after the session and you'll get the update then. So picking back up where we left off with the occupation of Iraq, you often cite the mass protests before the invasion of Iraq as evidence of increasing political consciousness since the 1960s. But while popular resistance increased during the escalation of the Vietnam War, it has declined since March 2003. How do you account for this?
Well, first of all, take a look at the history of popular resistance during the Vietnam War, which some of you are old enough to remember. The Vietnam War began in 1950, but it really took off in 1962. It was in 1962 that Kennedy initiated bombing of South Vietnam by the U.S. Air Force. They used South Vietnamese markings, but nobody was, the planes did, but nobody was fooled. It initiated the use of napalm, initiated chemical warfare to destroy crops and ground cover, started some operations against North Vietnam. There were no North Vietnamese anywhere near South Vietnam. And initiated programs which of driving the population into what amounted to concentration camps. They were called strategic hamlets, driving the population into concentration areas where they were surrounded by barbed wire to separate them from the guerrillas who the U.S. government knew that they were supporting. Very similar to what's happening in Afghanistan now. But that was 1962. You could learn about it. I mean, I learned about it by just happening to, for example, if you read the New York Times, if you got to page 27 or something, you could find a small item that reported some of these things casually because it was of no significance. And it continued, the war continued until by 1965, there was one, the leading specialist, most highly respected by the U.S. government, civilian specialist, was Bernard Fall. He's a French military historian and Vietnam specialist. So, for example, in Robert McNamara's memoirs, he's the only non-government person mentioned. He was so highly respected. And he was very good. He was very hawkish. But he cared about the Vietnamese, which sort of made him look as if he was on the left. By 1965, he described, I don't remember his exact words, but he said that South Vietnam is just simply being devastated by this enormous U.S. assault. And that's when troops started pouring in. 1965 is also when the U.S. expanded the war to the north. The goal was to try to pressure the North Vietnamese to call off the South Vietnamese resistance. There was no big secret about it. We now know a lot because a ton of materials come out in the Pentagon Papers and declassified materials, and it more or less adds a lot of depth and complexity to it. All of us could surmise at the time, even from the leaks that were coming along, so no great surprises. But it turns out that the U.S. understood very well that they were fighting the population, that the client government they introduced had essentially no support, and that they just had to fight a military war because that's our comparative advantage. There was no protest. I mean, virtually none. I can remember in as late as 1964, when I was trying to give talks on the Vietnam War, if we were doing it at a college, say at MIT where I was, we'd have to put together about 6 topics. Venezuela, where there was a guerrilla war going on, the Middle East, 5 other topics, and put Vietnam in there somewhere. And then maybe you could get 10 people to come out. give a talk in a church with 4 people, the minister, the organizer, a drunk who walked in off the streets, and some guy who wanted to kill you, and so on. I mentioned the first public demonstration in October 1965. That was at a time when Vietnam, it was really hanging in the balance. South Vietnam, could it survive? Virtually no protest. By then there were a couple of teach-ins, and there were some small demonstrations. SDS had a demonstration, but very little. By 1967, protest was really taking off. By that time, Bernard Fall again, he was killed in combat in South Vietnam. But his last book, Last Reflections on a War, came out in '67. And in it he says that he thinks it's doubtful that Vietnam will survive as a cultural and historical entity after the massive attack of the most extraordinary military machine that has ever been unleashed against a territory this size. Actually, it got much worse later against Laos and rural Cambodia, but that was '67, speaking about Vietnam. Okay, at that point you began to get protests. By then there were over 500,000 American troops in South Vietnam. The U.S. was extensively bombing the north. It had expanded the war to Laos, beginning to Cambodia, and Fall's account of South Vietnam was quite accurate. So yeah, you started to get protests. And among elites, there was never any protest, literally. So for example, I just, a couple of days ago, happened to read, there's a journal called Diplomatic History, which is one of the main scholarly journals. And among the scholarly journals, it's by far the most serious, but also the most open. It's the one where you can actually get some critical commentary. It's not just regurgitating state propaganda. And some really serious people. They're good, serious scholars. So they happen to have an issue devoted to Vietnam. And it's pretty interesting to read. It tells you a lot about the intellectual culture, the kind of dovish intellectual culture. Almost all the people there would call themselves opponents of the war. But the only positions that are represented are the standard position, which is the U.S. lost the war, which I think is false, and it was a mistake. And then what's called the revisionist position, which is the U.S. could have won the war if they'd fought harder. That's the revisionist position. It's kind of interesting because in the '60s, revisionism meant mild criticism of U.S. Cold War propaganda, like maybe both sides were involved. But the attitudes have shifted so far to the right that revisionism now means the ultra-hawkish position. And the orthodox position as well. It was a mistake, shouldn't have done it. Kind of like what you could read in Pravda in 1985 about the invasion of Afghanistan, or what you could have heard from the German general staff after Stalingrad, a mistake, tactical errors and so on. That's the liberal, dovish, critical position. Among the general population, however, things were changing, and there were big anti-war demonstrations, and there was activism, and it was significant. In January 1968, the Tet Offensive took place. That event has been grossly distorted in history. It was an amazing event. And if you're really interested in popular movements, you should really have a close look at it. South Vietnam was completely saturated with over 500,000 American troops, probably 100,000 or so mercenaries, South Korean, Taiwanese, Philippine, and so on. A huge client army, I think it was maybe 700,000 or so. Every village was penetrated with intelligence and government officials and so on. Nobody knew that the Tet Offensive was coming. It was a simultaneous uprising all over South Vietnam, took everybody by surprise. What that meant is that in every South Vietnamese village, people were already organized to rise up on a particular moment against the occupation, and it came as a complete surprise to the occupiers. That means nobody talked about it. or if somebody did talk about it, the eyes didn't see it and the ears didn't hear it. I don't think there's an event like that in history, of a spontaneous mass popular uprising. Well, the U.S. did succeed in putting it down by massive violence, extremely destructive. And now it's treated, for example, in this issue of diplomatic history that I mentioned, as a defeat for North Vietnam. Actually, North Vietnam wasn't even there. No, there were North Vietnamese troops, about 50,000 of them, a fraction of 10% of U.S. troops. But they were on the borders. They weren't in South Vietnam. In fact, they were on the borders, basically trying to draw American troops away from the country so that the uprising could take place. But this is called a defeat for the North Vietnamese, because ultimately, with massive firepower, the U.S. was able to put down the uprising. So that's the way it enters history, defeat for the North Vietnamese. But what actually happened is quite astonishing. And power centers in the United States understood it. Intellectuals still don't understand it, but the business community understood it. And basically, the business community at that point, there was a very interesting power play. There was a group called the Wise Men, big Wall Street hotshots and so on, who went to Washington and read the President a Riot Act. They told him, look, you're going to withdraw. You're going to have to stop escalating the war. It's costing us too much. It's harming the economy. Population's in an uproar. So you got to stop the bombing of North Vietnam, announce that you're not going to run for president. The election was coming up. Start negotiation and initiate withdrawal plans. And the president obediently did everything he was ordered to do instantaneously. Gives you good insight into how American politics works. In the intellectual community, something extremely interesting happened. It all of a sudden turned out that everybody had been a long-time opponent of the war. So the Kennedy memoirists, there were a lot of memoirs about Camelot and how wonderful it was. The Kennedy memoirists, Schlesinger, Sorensen, the rest of them, immediately rewrote all their histories, literally. Completely rewrote it, inventing the story, the fairy tale, which is very common on the left now, that Kennedy was trying to get out of the war. Total fairy tale, not a particle of evidence for it. He was a complete hawk. And if you look at their earlier memoirs at the time, they barely even mentioned Vietnam. They just took it for granted. Of course, if we want to destroy the country, who cares? People like Arthur Schlesinger or Robert Kennedy, they shifted. All of that passed without notice. You can't find a word about it in the history of the current history of the period. Okay, so we were lying like troopers, but we changed. Now we created a false history for ourselves, and that's fine. If you look at the Pentagon Papers, it ends. The Pentagon Papers ends around mid-68, a couple of months after the Tet Offensive. And the section on the last few months is extremely interesting. So interesting that it's never discussed. I don't think you can find a reference to it except in what I wrote and what Howard Zinn wrote and a couple other people. But it's quite interesting. It was a real shock in Washington. Up until that point, they thought they're going to win the war. And all of a sudden, it turned out there's this mass popular movement which had carried out this incredible event, and it's going to go on for a long time. Johnson, the president, wanted to send a couple 100,000 more troops to Vietnam after the Tet Offensive. The military didn't want to. Joint Chiefs were opposed for an interesting reason. They said, if we send more troops, we're going to have a civil war in the United States. We're going to need those troops for civil disorder control, because there'll be an uprising by young people, by women, by minorities, and so on, and we're going to need the army to put it down. So we don't want to send any more troops. Johnson didn't send any more troops, partly that, partly the business world telling him it's over. Well, those are all... In fact, why did the business world think there was an economic crisis? That's interesting, too. One of the real achievements of the anti-war movement, which you never find in the histories, and there are lots of scholarly books now about the anti-war movement, but they never mention its major achievement. because it's kind of ideologically impossible to incorporate into your version of the world. What the anti-war movement did was create enough disorder and opposition so that the government could never declare a national mobilization. Now, if you declare a national mobilization, first of all, it's extremely efficient for the economy. Like during the Second World War, when there was a national mobilization, the U.S. had its fastest growth in economic history. I mean, industrial production quadrupled. People were dedicated to the war effort, you know, Rosie the Riveter and all that kind of business, which was real. People were really dedicated to the war effort, and it was, for the economy, fantastic. It pulled the country out of depression, set the basis for post-war growth. Of course, it won the war, a huge war. But Johnson couldn't do it. There was too much discontent. So they could never call a national mobilization. They had to fight what's called a guns and butter war. So you pour money into the military, but you've got to keep the population satisfied. So that's the butter side. And that is inefficient, economically inefficient. It harms the economy. It led to stagflation, a combination of stagnation of growth and inflation, which was harming the economy. And that's what the business community understood would get much worse if they tried to escalate the war or even to continue it. So that's a major effect of the anti-war movement, but which only took off around 67, you know, shortly before this, you know, literally months before the Tet Offensive. Well, then it goes on. I won't go through the rest of the history, but it's pretty much the same. So those were the, and then it left a lasting impact on the country. So anti-war feelings just developed and grew along with a lot of other changes. The major effect of the 60s wasn't really felt then. So the major popular movements, like, say, the feminist movement, which had a huge impact on the country, probably more than anything else, but that's really from the 70s. I mean, it was started in the 60s, you know, there are bits and pieces of it, but kind of really took off in the 70s. There was no environmental, barely any environmental movement in the 60s. It started around 1970, Earth Day, and so on. And the same is true of the anti-nuclear movement, 80s, and so on. It all comes later, the solidarity movements of the 1980s. But it had its roots in the activism of the 60s, and it kept expanding. Under a lot of repression, there were major efforts to try to beat it back, all kind of ways. I mean, the war on drugs, I can go into this if you like, but a large part of it was a very explicit effort, not concealed, to try to put down, to impose what was called law and order, to get the society to be passive and obedient again, and also to reverse the concern that by 1970 the population, though not the elites, were actually beginning to seriously question the righteousness and justice of American policy, and that's dangerous. It was very well understood by 1970 that, you know, the whole culture is shifting in a dangerous direction, where you don't just reflexively assume that whatever the U.S. government does is right and just, though it may be mistaken, which is virtually uniform in the intellectual world. I mean, those of you who are in, you know, study these things in college, it's just like it's like an axiom. You can't even question it. If you question it, you're considered a madman. But among the population, that was being very seriously questioned. In fact, polls were showing that about 70% of the population described the war as not a mistake, but fundamentally wrong and immoral. Okay, that's pretty scary. Kind of like sit-down strikes in the 30s. It's really scary. So you had to do something so that we held the moral high ground, that we're the victims of the Vietnamese. Sounds like a hard thing to carry off, but it was done brilliantly. And the war on drugs was a major part of it. In part, it had other, other purposes, like imprisoning the black population. It's another story. But part of it was trying to gain the moral high ground in the war in Vietnam. Quite tricky when you've just, destroyed 4 countries, killed a couple million people in a war of aggression that had absolutely no credible pretext. But it was done. And the drug war was a central part of it. Around 70 or so, a lot of propaganda started about an addicted army. It's a myth. There was no, in fact, there's a very good book, scholarly book on it, The Myth of the Addicted Army by Jerry Kuzmarov. Goes into a lot of the details. But the basic story is that the army, soldiers were using drugs, but at about the same level as civilians at home. I mean, they're young people, so it's kind of like the youth culture. And they were using drugs at about the level of the youth culture. It had no effect on combat that anybody could ever detect. There was actual addiction in the army, but it was alcohol and tobacco, both of which are much more serious than what are called drugs. And that was serious, but that's not called addiction, because that's what rich people do. But a myth was created about an addicted army, and that was contrived, reconstructed as an effort by the evil communists to attack us. They were addicting our army to try to turn our army into a collection of junkies who'd come home and, riots in the streets and destroy the country and so on. And that was extremely effective. You had people like Walter Cronkite, who you may remember or know was the great liberal hero on television. Walter Cronkite giving, lecturing on his television programs about how our boys in Vietnam not only have to face the guns of these evil communists who are daring to defend their own villages, but also to face the drugs that they're trying to addict our soldiers with. So they're facing two kinds of enemies. So we're really the victims of the Vietnamese who are attacking us with not only their guns, but even their drugs. And so the idea that the Vietnamese are attacking us with their guns was deeply rooted. You go back to the Camelot days, Kennedy. It's exactly what they said. So Adlai Stevenson, who was the liberal hero, UN ambassador, he was giving talks at the UN about how in South Vietnam we're fighting a new kind of war, a war of what he called internal aggression. What's that? That means the South Vietnamese are carrying out aggression against us in South Vietnam. President Kennedy spoke about what he called the assault from within. They're attacking us from within Vietnam. By now, that's like second nature. So Iraq and Afghanistan are described exactly the same way. Come back to it if you like. It's an assault from within, aggression against us in their country. Israel does the same thing. They talk about Iranian aggression against Israel in South Lebanon, where the Israeli army was occupying it, and there was guerrilla resistance. So that's Iranian aggression against Israel in South Lebanon. These are, in imperial history, there's a lot of horrible stuff, but it's pretty hard to find anything that's this grotesque. But by now it's just like second nature in the U.S. intellectual culture. So Kennedy and Stevenson, nobody objected when they talked in those terms. And by 1970 or so, you get the liberal icons like Walter Cronkite saying, well, they're attacking us not only with guns, but even with drugs. So we're the victims of the Vietnamese. It was a very successful propaganda campaign. Just carry it forward. By 1977, time to get to Carter. Carter was president. He was actually asked in a press conference, do we owe some debt to the Vietnamese? After all, killed maybe 4 million people, destroyed their country and so on. He said, we owe them no debt because the destruction was mutual. So, yeah, we did some things to them, but look at what they did to us. So it's mutual, so it's finished. Actually, the French say exactly the same thing today about what they did to Haiti. I mean, they just wiped out Haiti. I mean, it's a long, complicated story. A lot of France's wealth comes from it. But they say, well, we don't owe them anything, because look what they did to us. I mean, they stole our property, namely the slave plantations. They didn't pay an indemnity for it. Actually, they did pay an indemnity. And look at how many white people they killed when they liberated themselves. So it's all even, This goes on all the time, but it's particularly egregious here. So by 1977, we owe them no debt because the destruction was mutual. That's Jimmy Carter, great liberal. by the time you get to George Bush #1, that's like 1990, it's going even further. Bush was giving orations about how there were discussions then about whether to lift the sanctions on Vietnam. The war didn't come to an end when we stopped bombing them, imposed heavy sanctions, all sorts of other things. So the question is whether to reduce the constraints enough so that they can enter into international markets. And Bush gave a speech in which he said, well, we can never forgive the Vietnamese for what they did to us, of course, but we're gracious people, and so we will agree to allow them some entry into the international system, but only if they face up to the one moral issue that remains after the war. What's the one moral issue? Well, finding the bones of American pilots who they viciously shot down in their aggression against us over North Vietnam. Not a word of protest. Look, you can, those of you who do media studies can look back. Big public pronouncements, not a word of protest, that's taken for granted. You know, part of their aggression against us was defending their villages, then it got worse, they were addicting our army, which is a myth. Then comes, you know, they didn't find the bones of our soldiers that they maliciously shot down, like over central Iowa or something. And that goes on right until today. I mean, all kind of stuff about POWs who were never returned, big issue, and so on. Well, that was it's an amazing propaganda achievement, which was extremely successful, and the drug war was a large part of it. Well, you know, these were among the ways of trying to, there were many others, like, for example, raising college tuitions. For those of you who are in college, most of you are going to come out of college with a big debt. Why? Is it for economic reasons? It's not for economic reasons. You take a poor country like Mexico, in fact, most countries, education is free. You know? Public education is free, or practically free. In the United States, a super rich country, education is extremely expensive, even at public universities. And the idea is to impose a heavy debt so that you're trapped. You come out of college with a debt, you're trapped. You're going to do what the system demands. I mean, you may have gone to law school with the intention of becoming a public interest lawyer, but if you come out with, you know, $50,000 in debt, you're going to have to go to work for a corporate law firm. And you can tell yourself, well, I'm just going to go work there until I pay off my debt. But, you know, once you get into the corporate law firm culture, it's going to be really hard to break out of it because of, for all sorts of reasons, which you can see on television. So it's a way of trapping people. And there's a whole pile of other techniques that are used, but interestingly, they didn't work. I mean, they worked to an extent, but anti-war activism grew, and other forms of activism grew, and they are still growing. So global justice movements, solidarity movements, and so on. So it's a long story, but I think it's a good history to review and to learn from. You can struggle against these things. It's particularly striking in the light of history. You know, just about every war leads to radicalization of the population. People start to think, you know, wars sort of stir things up. And the radicalization leads to a repression, almost reflexively. So during this First World War, the population was to some, there was, you know, uprising in the labor movement, labor activism, you know, popular concerns of all kinds. Woodrow Wilson instituted what was called the Red Scare after the war, the worst repression in American history. Crushed the labor movement, crushed independent thought, led to a decade of passivity, the 1920s, which was considered kind of end of history. You know, the masters have won, everything's fine. Then came the Depression and everything changed. The Second World War was the same. The Second World War, which had come right after the Great Depression, that radicalized populations all over the world, in Europe and Asia and the United States, everywhere. And there was a large-scale repression afterwards. We'll do it now, but the first task of the British and American conquerors was to destroy the anti-fascist resistance everywhere in the world and to reimpose the traditional order, including fascist collaborators. That was one part of it. So the first, should be chapter 1 of post-war history, actually began in around 1943 when they started moving into Europe. But it happened at home too. There was a massive propaganda campaign, also legislative and so on, to try to destroy the radicalized labor movement and popular dissent and popular concerns. And it was pretty successful. It's kind of like Wilson's Red Scare. It's what's called McCarthyism, but that's very misleading. The 1950s were a very quiet, passive decade for the most part, kind of like the 1920s. Then came the 60s and everything blew up again. Well, after the Vietnam War led to the same kind of thinking, concerns, activism, radicalization, and there was the expected repression, which we're still living with. You know, it's still going on, but it was much less effective. It didn't have the same dampening effect as the traditional ones have had. And I think both the activism and the repression are still underway. We're right in the middle of that struggle. You know. So I think that's, roughly speaking, the history of it. Getting back to the Iraq War, by the time the Iraq War is the first time in imperial history that there was, in hundreds of years, there was massive protest before the war officially began. I mean, we actually now know from leaked information that the war had already been underway for about a year, but we didn't know at the time. So before the war began, there was huge international protest, and I think that put a significant brake on what the U.S. and its British client were able to do, leading to the kinds of consequences we talked about before, which it's still an ongoing battle. You know.
Shifting gears and looking at another topic, we know that not too long ago you traveled down to Venezuela and met with President Hugo Chavez. What was your evaluation of both Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution?
Well, first of all, I was there for about 20 hours, I think, so not time for an evaluation of anything. I spent some time talking to Chavez, so I did too. And I was pretty impressed with him as a person. He talked frankly, openly, asked questions, answered questions. Some of the answers were pretty interesting, things I didn't know. So, for example, one thing that I have been, we don't have a lot of documentation from that period, so we don't have real information, except peripheral about what U.S. policy planning was, what were they thinking in Washington. But his version of it, at least, which I hadn't really thought of, but it sounded plausible to me, is that at first, when he took office, he was treated as kind of like a bad, kind of a bad boy, but not really dangerous, so we'll kind of civilize him. Even when he visited Castro, he said he was still just tapped on the wrist and said, yeah, I kind of will laugh. But he said policy really turned against him sharply when he took part in an OPEC meeting, the oil cartel, and convinced them, as he did, to lower oil production, which would raise prices. Prices were very low at the time. And OPEC did agree to reduce production. He said at that time he switched from, bad boy but no problem to a real enemy. And ever since then, it's been real hostility. He was touching a sore point. You don't fiddle with U.S. domination of the global energy system. And a couple of other things. I mean, to evaluate what's going on, I can't tell. It's complicated. A lot of things are happening. I saw a few things, but not enough to draw any conclusions. Not enough to modify what I can figure out just by reading.
Tonight you'll be talking about the Middle East, so we won't ask you too much about that, but something a bit more personal. Not too personal. Have there been any difficulties being Jewish and being in solidarity with the Palestinian people?
I'm not sure. There's a standard actually, the Israeli statesman, famous Israeli statesman, Abba Eban, very much respected, considered a leading Gov, back in around early 70s, I guess. He wrote an interesting article, which you might want to take a look at. It appeared in Congress Weekly. It's the Journal of the American Jewish Congress, the sort of more kind of liberal wing of the organized Jewish community. And in the article, he described that he lectured to American Jews about their task. And he said their task is to show that criticism of, he called it criticism of Zionism. It means criticism of the policies of the State of Israel, not Zionism. So criticism of the policies of the State of Israel is either anti-Semitism or neurotic Jewish self-hatred. That's their task. Okay, that covers 100% of criticism, so we don't have to worry about criticism. And he sort of captured it. That's what you have to do. If non-Jews criticize the policies of Israel, it's anti-Semitism, and that wipes that off. Like you could see it with the flotilla, or just pick anything you like. If Jews criticize it, it's neurotic self-hatred. Actually, Evan picked two examples at the time. One of them was me, naturally. The other was Izzy Stone, which is kind of interesting because Izzy Stone was a really dedicated Zionist, and in fact, pretty right-wing Zionist. He was supporting the Irgun, the right-wing terrorist groups. But by the late 1960s and early 70s, he was becoming pretty critical of the occupation policies. So that was neurotic Jewish self-hatred, those two cases. And yeah, you're faced with that, of course, all the time. It has deep origins in Jewish history. I mean, here nobody knows anything, but in Israel, it's kind of interesting in Israel, because there they study the Bible. If you go through the schools in Israel, you study the Bible. Maybe you forget everything, like when we study American history, you forget everything, but at least they study it. And if you study the Bible, you know that this idea has biblical origins. Some of you have had the right kind of religious education may recall that in the Bible there is one figure who's the absolute epitome of evil, is King Ahab, the worst. Ahab and Jezebel, you remember that stuff. So King Ahab was the ultimate evil king. And at one point, Ahab called to him the prophet Elijah, and Elijah came. And Ahab condemned him, as a phrase translates, as a hater of Israel. Okay, that's the origin of the conception of neurotic Jewish self-hatred, and in fact it's the origin of the conception of anti-Americanism. Ahab, why was Elijah a hater of Israel? Because he was condemning the acts of the evil king. Elijah, like the other prophets, was what we would call a dissident intellectual. He was criticizing state policy, he was giving geopolitical analysis, he was calling for, bringing in moral values, the concern for widows and orphans and that sort of thing, what we would call a dissident intellectual, critical intellectual. And of course the prophets were treated very badly, but that's driven into the desert, imprisoned, denounced and so on, but that's normal. That's the way critical intellectuals are treated in every society. So anyway, Elijah was a hater of Israel, and you can understand Ahab's point. He was a pure totalitarian, naturally, he was the king. And if you criticize the king, you're criticizing Israel, because to a pure totalitarian, the state is identified with the country, the society, the culture, the people. It's all the state. That's pure totalitarianism. So if you criticize the state and its policies, you're criticizing the country and the culture and so on. So that's actually, if you think about the concept of anti-Americanism, which you hear all the time, it's the same thing. It's pure totalitarianism. You criticize the acts of the state, you're anti-American. Pure totalitarianism. In fact, the only countries where this concept is even used, I think, are in the United States and in real totalitarian states. So like in the old Soviet Union, if you criticized the state, you were anti-Soviet. In the Brazilian military dictatorship, if you criticized the dictatorship, you were anti-Brazilian. In the United States, if you criticize state policy, you're anti-American. And the U.S. propaganda, the U.S. power are so enormous that in Europe, which is very subservient to the United States culturally, they don't like to admit it. They think they're very independent. But they basically kind of reflexively adopt U.S. attitudes. They also use the concept anti-American, not recognizing that they're just demonstrating that they're pure totalitarians. Well, that's straight back to biblical origins. And yeah, and that's Evan's lecture to Americans and American Jews. And sure, you get that all the time. So Jewish self-hatred, yeah, it just comes. It comes with a turf. It's nothing to be upset about. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. And it's not just on this issue. I mean, you take any issue that in the United States, support for Israel is kind of reflexive. But if you go to, say, England, where support for Israel is strong, but not as reflexive as here, they have their own analogs. You go to England and you try to criticize the holiness of the U.S.-British bombing of Serbia, which is kind of like a religious doctrine there, you get the same thing. You're supporting terror, you're anti-American, and so on and so forth. I mean, states and cultures do tend to have religious doctrines that the intellectual classes adhere to and propagate, and typically they support power systems. And if you question them, you're going to face one or another kind of punishment. It depends on the nature of the society. If you're in, say, Eastern Europe, in the post-Stalin era, say Czechoslovakia, you get thrown into jail, like Havel. If you're in an American dependency like El Salvador, you get your head blown off, like that's happened repeatedly. But it just depends on the nature of the society. If you're in the United States, you get vilified, but maybe sometimes worse. But it comes with turf. You just expect it. I mean, yes, if you question power systems, they're not going to like it. And every power system has a class of people called intellectuals who are basically state worshippers, power worshippers. And they're going to overwhelmingly perform their task, which is to defend power against critical analysis. If they can't do it by argument and evidence, they'll do it by slander and vilification. And if you happen to be in El Salvador, blowing your brains out. It's just you can't get upset about it. If it didn't happen, it would be a miracle.
Looking more broadly at vision for the type of society that we want, what are your thoughts on the development of how we relate to children as a society and as parents, and what do you believe our roles and responsibilities are when it comes to raising children and enabling them to participate positively in society?
You answered it. You should help children grow in ways which enable them to participate constructively in the society. And there are a lot of ways to do that. And so, for example, children do require a certain level of discipline. So, just my personal experience, once I had 3 kids, and once I slapped one of my kids on the hand. She cried. She had put her hand, we have an electric stove. She was about 3 years old. She put her hand on the electric grill, which stays hot after the stove goes off. So I grabbed her hand and slapped it. Okay, she cried. She didn't like it, but she learned not to put her hand on the stove. Well, I don't think it was a terrible thing to do, but there are points at which you have to impose limits for the safety of the child. But for the most part, children should just be encouraged to explore the world and use their natural creative instincts, give them every opportunity to do it. just things that just come natural to any sensible parent. You can construct some fancy rhetoric about it, and it's sometimes done, but I think it's pretty simple-minded, like most things that have to do with human affairs. I mean, in human affairs, either we don't understand it because it's too complex, or it's so simple we can describe it simply. Again, intellectuals have a task of making it look complicated, but it's very hard to see much justification for the complication. It's almost, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's pretty close to true that either we don't understand it because it's way too complex, or else we sort of understand it and we can put it in simple terms, and we all sort of know it as soon as we think about it. So I don't think there's anything profound to say about respect for children and helping them develop and grow.
What pitfalls and benefits do you see in Parecon, participatory
In
economics? Parecon, participatory economics. Do you think it is an ideal form of future socialism? Why or why not? If it turns out, or if the evidence seems to suggest that competitive behavior is intrinsic component of human nature, what does that imply for the core ideals of a participatory society?
Well, I don't think that's, I mean, Mike and I have been talking about this for decades, but my own feeling is I'm kind of skeptical about detailed planning of a society, partly for the reason I just mentioned. I don't think we know enough about human beings and about societies to be able to sketch in great detail how they should or would behave under various conditions. So maybe this is the right way, but my feeling is that this has to be a lot of experimentation. Different kinds of forms of cooperation and mutual support, mutual aid have to be considered. There may be lots of options. Some of them may have consequences we haven't thought of. Some of them may work out in different ways. I mean, I think there are particular questions that can be raised. Like, for example, should people be remunerated on the basis of effort? I don't think that's obvious. I think there's some justification in the old principle to each according to his needs, from each according to its ability. Actually, that's a pretty conservative position. I mean, about a majority of Americans think that that's so obvious that it must be in the Constitution, literally. And I think it is a sort of when Americans say it's in the Constitution, that just means, it's obviously true, because nobody knows what's in the Constitution. But there's been several polls which have shown that, and I think it's a pretty reasonable position. So I'm not convinced that remuneration according to effort is the right idea. Try it, see, try other things, see, and so on. And exactly what kind of, the idea of distributing work equitably, it's a nice ideal, but I'm not sure it's the right ideal. I mean, it may be that people are just different in the kinds of work that they're happy doing. And it seems to me that's a competing ideal, so you have to ask how to reconcile those two things. And there are a lot of other questions that arise along the way. I don't have answers to them. My feeling is they have to be worked out by experiment.
There was a second part to that. What if it turns out, or if the evidence seems to suggest that competitive behavior is an intrinsic component of human nature, what does that imply for this future type of society?
I mean, we know that competitive behavior is intrinsic to human nature because people do it. I mean, and we know that cooperation is intrinsic to human nature because people do it. I mean, human nature allows a lot of options. Which ones tend to predominate depends on all sorts of things, including social circumstances, culture, social support, power systems, and so on. I mean, you can't say much about human nature. I mean, we ought to be really cautious about that notion. I mean, of course there's an intrinsic human nature. There's got to be. Otherwise we'd be angels. So yes, there's an intrinsic human nature. It's probably highly restricted. There's some domains where we can even learn something about how restrictive it is, and it's very restrictive. We don't see the restrictions because we take it for granted. Like we take it for granted that everybody's kind of like us. How else could you be, you know? But some other creature looking at us would find what we do extremely puzzling. Remember that it's well to remember the history of science. I mean, for about 2,000 years, scientists took it as just obvious that if you detach an apple from a tree, it falls down instead of going up. And if you boil water, the steam goes up, not down. And the reason was obvious, they're going to their natural place. That was considered an answer by scientists for 2,000 years. Not a small amount of time, and not stupid people. Finally, in the 17th century, a few people, like say Galileo, were willing to be puzzled about what seems obvious. Well, as soon as you start being puzzled about what seems obvious, you immediately see we don't understand anything. You know, we don't understand why some things fall down and others go up. And when you start to look into it, you find that other assumptions that were made about it just collapse. Like the idea that rate of fall depends on mass. Well, that's obvious, you know, except it's false. And it was shown to be false, not as fable indicates, by Galileo dropping balls off the top of the Tower of Pisa. If he tried that, it probably wouldn't have worked. Like most experiments don't work. He showed it by a thought experiment, like most of what he sort of proved. Very ingenious thought experiment, very convincing. But the basic point is that people allowed themselves to be puzzled. They quickly discovered that nothing is understood, and you get the origins of modern science. Well, you know, we haven't yet allowed ourselves to be puzzled about human behavior. We haven't reached the point, psychologically, of the Galilean revolution. We just take for granted that people do the kinds of things they do, and they look like they do, and so on and so forth. But everything about it is quite puzzling when you start thinking about it. I mean, my own particular interest in this area happens to be mainly acquisition of language. And, you know, the general assumption is, how could there be anything puzzling about it? Look, we all do it, you know, infants do it, and so on, so forget it, it's all obvious. You know, teaching, training, you know, induction, whatever that is, analogy, whatever that is, and so on. Well, that's like pre-Galilean physics. Apples falling to the ground and steam rising. As soon as you allow yourself to be puzzled, you find out it's extraordinarily strange that it happens. And the ways in which it happens show that there's a highly restrictive human nature that leads to a very few options. And the same is true of every domain you look at. Vision, planning, physical growth, social behavior, and so on. There are very few options. And to discover them, if we could discover them, we'd know what human nature is. But you can't discover them unless you're willing at least to be puzzled by what seems obvious. Till you make that psychological leap, you're going to be in the stage of things go to their natural place. And that's where we are in the case of human nature. But if you really look at it, we don't know anything about human nature. And we know something, but very little. In fact, we don't even know very much about insect nature, which is much easier to study, and we don't have that psychological barrier that we have about ourselves. It's experimentally much easier to study, of course. These are really hard questions. So is competitiveness part of human nature? Well, trivially, yes, because it takes place. Is cooperation, solidarity, and mutual aid and support part of it? Sure, because we see that. What are the constraints? How do they show up in different circumstances? I mean, you know, we have experience, intuitive ideas, a little bit of history, but nothing in the way of really serious understanding. So almost anything that's said about human nature, you have to take with an immense grain of salt, because our approach to it is pre-Galilean. We have not, except for rare areas and a few people, you are not allowed, we haven't reached the point where you can be puzzled even about what's in front of your eyes. If you can't do that, you can't have any understanding. And this is not just true of the general public, it's true of scientists, evolutionary biologists, psychologists, philosophers, and it's across the board. practically the whole intellectual culture, including science, is pre-Galilean when you deal with human nature. I could give you some striking examples, but then we get off into another area. But that's just a hard leap to make. And it's, again, it's well known to us by now, but kind of striking that it took 2,000 years for science to be willing to be puzzled about something as elementary as the fact that stones go down and steam goes up. How can you be puzzled about that? Well, if you can't be puzzled about that, you don't have science. That's the first step. Once you are puzzled, you find quickly that everything you believed about it is wrong.
Some individuals on the radical and progressive left are discussing the formation of a revolutionary organization for a participatory or libertarian socialist society. Are there historical examples you would point to in order to illustrate what an effective organization of this kind might look like? What challenges did that organization face, or how were they overcome? If challenges were not overcome, what might that organization have done to overcome them?
Well, the most successful case and the most striking one that I know of in history is the Spanish Revolution in 1936, which I've written about. In 1936, a revolution did occur in large parts of Spain, industrial Catalonia, rural Aragon, other regions. And if you look at it, it looks kind of spontaneous. It happened quickly, all of a sudden, as soon as the Franco armies attacked. But of course, it wasn't at all spontaneous. It had been going on for 50 years. There had been about a half a century of education, organizing. There were anarchist schools, there were uprisings, there were takeovers of towns, which were then crushed by force. A whole history of experience, experiment, initiatives, defeats, and so on. And it led to the point where what to do was just in people's heads. People had a conception of what to do, widespread conception of what to do. And when the opportunity arose, they did it. So, it looks spontaneous from one point of view, but it was the result of a very substantial effort in rural and industrial areas in Spain. And it was pretty successful. It had its problems, but it was in the middle of a war, for one thing, so big problems. It was finally crushed. It was crushed actually in about a year, but it took the combined forces of every power in the world to crush it. It was crushed by the combined forces of so-called communism, Stalinism, fascism, and the liberal democracies. They disagreed on a lot of things, but they agreed on crushing the Spanish Revolution. And after they had crushed the revolution, they started off on what's called the Spanish Civil War, and it was a question of who would pick up the spoils. When we study it, we study the period after the crushing of the revolution. The first task accepted across the board by the power systems of the world is you got to crush the revolution. We cannot allow self-management, independence, freedom, justice, people taking control of their own lives. That's much too dangerous. Every power system understood this. And it was finally crushed in approximately a year. But it was very successful. And, a lot of flaws, a lot of things were done wrong. It's conceivable that they could have won the war, but it would have had to follow very different tactics. After the revolution was crushed, a popular opposition to the Franco invasion diminished substantially because what people had really wanted was already crushed. So yes, there was resistance to the invasion, but it was kind of like a conventional war. There would have been possible alternatives, and they were suggested. Actually, the most interesting suggestion, which might have worked, was by an Italian anarchist, Camillo Berneri, an Italian anarchist who was in Spain, who suggested an alternative strategy instead of just fighting a war, conventional war. He suggested a strategy which then sounded outlandish, but by now it doesn't sound so outlandish. He suggested that in Spain itself, the real revolutionary forces should conduct a guerrilla war, not a conventional war. Well, by now, actually the concept of guerrilla war is very deeply rooted in Spain. In fact, it grows from Spain. That's why it's called guerrilla. But it developed during the French Napoleonic invasion. And as we've seen in more recent history, it can be pretty successful. But it was combined with something else. He suggested a political war. Franco's armies the fascist armies, they were based in North Africa. And they were using mostly what are called Moorish soldiers, North African soldiers from Morocco and Algeria. That was the base, the popular base for Franco's army. So Berneri suggested, there was a revolution going on in North Africa, the Korean Revolution. And he suggested supporting the revolution in North Africa, which was trying to break up the colonial system, break it down, and break up, colonial landholding, give land to the peasants, and so on and so forth. He suggested supporting that, which he thought would erode the base of the invading army. Well, that was totally unacceptable to any of the great powers, Stalin, Roosevelt, anybody, of course the fascists, because they're not going to allow the breakdown of imperial systems. So it might not have worked, but it might have worked. In fact, it was the only technique that could have worked. A guerrilla war in Spain and revolutionary war in North Africa, but it wasn't considered. There was too much dedication to state power and to conventional ideas about how to fight wars. So what you get is a conventional war in Spain, which we can read about in the history books, which the fascists won. But that's the most successful example I know. There are other cases. That one's, I think, merits careful study. I should say, in connection with that war, there were proposals by anarchist historians and analysts there were very detailed proposals about how to organize every particular of the Spanish Revolutionary Society. And the most extreme that I know of was by an Argentine anarchist, Abad de Santillan. I think by now his book is probably translated into English. I think it was called After the Revolution or something like that. Probably Haymarket or somebody has it. But I had the same feeling about that I have about Parecon. I think it's just too detailed. You have too much experiment is needed to find out what you can do. But it was an interesting set of ideas, maybe right. And there are other experiences through history. In fact, there are bits and pieces of it all over the place. There are pieces in American history. In fact, right now in the United States, there are probably thousands of enterprises that are worker managed. That were not huge ones, but some of them pretty successful, and they use different plans, different efforts. And it's a deeply rooted idea in American working class history. I go back to the earlier industrial revolution here, say around New England. It was kind of taken for granted by working people that the slogan was, "Those who work in the mills should own them and manage them." It was also taken for granted in the late 19th century that there's basically no difference between wage labor and slavery. The only difference is that wage labor is temporary, but otherwise it's like slavery. And that's without any influence from Marx or European socialism or anything else. It's just the instinctive, automatic assumption of working people. In fact, it was so widespread that it was a slogan of the Republican Party. It was advocated in the New York Times. Abraham Lincoln held that view. But more significantly, that was the intuitive feeling of working people who were at that point being kind of like driven into the industrial system, which they bitterly opposed. It was taking away their freedom. But they said, wage labor is just slavery. It shouldn't exist. Well, I doubt that these ideas are very are buried very deeply. I mean, of course, there's been a century and a half of efforts to drive such thoughts out of people's minds, but I suspect they're pretty close to the surface, and they can be brought to the surface and used as the basis for experiment and activism and actual, economic building little pieces of it in different parts of the society.
Coming back to what we're trying to do here at Z Media Institute, what do you think of today's citizens and activist journalism in confronting the mainstream media and addressing the issues that we've been discussing here today?
Like I said, when you talk about human affairs, you either don't know anything or you can produce truisms. The truism in this case is it's critically necessary. I mean, unless there's some way of reaching the public, in fact, even ourselves, with internal debate and discussion, with kind of an alternative perspective on what the world is like and how it could be, there won't be any steps forward. I mean, going back to the late 19th century, one of the exciting things in the American working class, industrial working class, was that it was full of adversarial journalism. I mean, that's probably the period of the freest press in the United States. Hundreds of newspapers, a lot of them written by working people in factories, what were called factory girls, young women from the farms who went into the mills, or artisans from Boston that were in the mills and so on. They had a very lively, vibrant press. A lot of it is available. It's now available in printed books. You can pick up a lot of it. Philip Foner has a left-wing labor historian, has published a big collection. I think it's called Factory Girls or something like that. There's one of the first books in American labor history, maybe about 70 years ago or 80 years ago, by Norman Ware, which is called The Industrial Worker, was reprinted a few years ago, and it has pretty interesting excerpts from that literature. That was a lively adversarial press, and it lasted as late as the 1950s. There were, I think, 800 labor newspapers reaching about 30 million people, which was pretty radical and quite interesting. It's taken a long time to destroy the adversarial press, in other words. In England, the same thing happened, and it has to be reconstructed. That's the only way to hope to bring people to comprehend what the world is, or even to figure out their own ideas. I mean, that's one of the ways that the participants themselves learn. Try out ideas, get reactions to them, enter a reasonable dialogue, try to reach out to others, get their ideas. That's just a core part of any step toward the future, any decent step toward the future. So those are the truisms.
Embarrassingly, this morning we didn't think we would get through all the questions that we did just now, and we seem to have covered everything.
That's because everything's obvious.
Do you want to? Do you want to take questions now, or do you want to?
Sure.
Okay. I'll pick people out, and then we can just go from there. We are going to end this at 3:30 sharp, so we can get back on board. You first.
My question was there, but it hasn't been covered. My question is what's going on in India, which is right now a huge attack on the Maoist people's movements by the state, by the leftist parties, and which has also spilled into vitriol against anything that Arundhati Roy says right now. People's movements being maligned by the state as well as the left parties as being Maoist movements, and kind of raising a fervor against to increase the state violence and the corporate violence. So do you have a stance on that?
Well, Arundhati Roy just published some important articles in Outlook. I think you can probably find them on the internet. Yeah. Pardon? They're on the internet. Yeah, she spent a couple of weeks, I think, in the tribal areas in the midst of what's called the Maoist revolution. This has been going on for a long time, taking different forms. In fact, India, post-liberation India, has had an extremely violent history of internal war, all kinds. And this is a main part of it. It's, India is a very much stratified society. The caste system breaks people up into various strata, Brahmins are the highest, Dalits are so-called untouchables are the lowest. Then there's the tribal people who aren't even in the caste system. They're so low they don't even fit into it. And they're the most repressed people, the indigenous people. They're like the indigenous population is usually the most repressed population. So in India they're called tribal people. And they live in the forests, and which is a large part of India. I mean, if you take a look at the map of India, a large part of it's in flames. The areas where they live happen to be pretty rich in resources. And the Indian government, left to right, want the resources. And there is a conflict of interest. I mean, should you use the resources, or should you allow the tribal peoples to have their traditional way of life? Actually, that's happening all over the place, not just there. It's happening in the United States, in the Amazon, all over the place. In India, it's taking a particularly brutal and violent form. India is an extremely violent society. You're Indian, I suppose. Yeah, if you visit India and you just read the newspapers, the newspapers are full of, the police killed 5 people in this village somewhere, and so on and so forth. It's just going on all the time. This particular popular movement, the one that Arundhati Roy described, is led by people who call themselves Maoists. They're not tribal people. I mean, they're outsiders who were driven out of other areas where they had tried to carry out what they call Maoist revolutions. They sort of worked their way into the tribal societies and are now kind of a leadership group hidden somewhere in the forest somewhere. I think they're a pretty vicious group, frankly. My feeling is that Arundhati tended to romanticize it a bit by just living with the people themselves. It's quite different from trying to figure out what the leadership is. And they've done some pretty awful things. I wouldn't trust them as far as you could throw them. But the tribal people are caught. They are the ones who are helping the tribal people defend themselves. And there's a major attack on them by the Indian military and paramilitary. It's called the Green Hunt. And at the core of it is who's going to get control of the resources and the way of life of these huge areas. It's not going to be simple to... I think Arundhati's account is very moving, but I think there's a lot of critical accounts, too, that have appeared in the same journal. In fact, Nirmal Mukherjee had a long article, which was... He's a close friend of Arundhati's, incidentally. Good, serious leftist critic who was very critical, and said, yeah, it's sort of right about the tribal people, but she's overlooking the Maoist leadership, which is, according to him, plausibly, I think, just a bunch of gangsters and criminals. So it's not uncommon for popular groups to be trapped into efforts to defend themselves, but led by elements that are pretty vicious, and not the first time in history. I think that's what's happening. It's happening over a large part of India. I mean, India, everything we read about India is, fantastic growth and development. It's going to overtake the United States, and so on and so forth. Shining India, it's called. Well, that's true for, maybe 15% of the population, something roughly like that, which is not a small number of people. It's a couple 100,000 people, so a couple 100 million people, got the wrong number. So that's a big number who have, in fact, been lifted out of poverty by the neoliberal programs, although it actually went before that. However, there's another 800 million or so who are not only not part of this, but are probably declining. So the rate of food, the level of food consumption in India, average food consumption, has actually declined notably during the program, the neoliberal programs. And it's the same policies. The same policies that build those great IT centers and laboratories in Hyderabad, those same policies are taking away rural credit and rural aid centers and irrigation development and so on from the poor farmers right nearby. And in fact, the rate of peasant suicides have been rising about as fast as the number of billionaires. Those are two sides of the program. For the first time in Indian history, there are permanent migrations from the rural areas to the cities. There always were temporary migrations, depending on the monsoon and the harvest and so on and so forth. But now they're permanent migrations. So you go into the big cities like Mumbai, and kind of the most hideous slums you can even imagine if you look at them. And that's all driven in there from rural areas by the same programs that are creating the great IT programs. Just the other face of it. If you look at, take a look at India and the UN Human Development Report. There's an annual study that kind of tries to rank countries in terms of various, pretty sensible measures of human development. The last time I looked, India was about 135th, I think. Not exactly taking over the world. I think it was lower than Laos and Tajikistan. So way down there, and that's very misleading because India is highly inegalitarian. So that means that maybe like 1 billion people are way lower even than that. And there's a sector, the kind we know and the kind we see, who are very rich and very reactionary, incidentally, and closely linked to the U.S., all Silicon Valley and so on. Okay, that's another part of India. And the attack on the indigenous people in the tribal area, it just fits into this whole policy. And something similar can be said about China. So it's, they got plenty of internal problems. This is even overlooking the huge problem in Kashmir, where Indian repression is horrendous. And the Pakistani terrorists is bad, so there's no nice guys around.
And the Northeast too.
And
we have terrible repression in the Northeast.
In the Northeast, yeah, the same. The so-called Maoist revolution comes out of what was called the Naxalite movement. And it's, I don't know if it's been studied very well, maybe it has been, but actually I've seen little pieces of it myself. I once went through West Bengal, which was one of the centers of it, with a friend who's an agricultural economist, V.K. Ramachandran. I don't know if you know him, kind of a left-wing agricultural economist who works in those areas. And we also went with a government representative who happened to be Minister of Finance, I think. He was a PhD from MIT, who I ran into in the 70s, economics PhD. But we just went around and visited villages, panchayat, kind of self-governing villages. And they're pretty interesting. I mean, we visited them unheralded. They didn't know we were coming. So we just kind of walked in. And one village, as we walked in, they're very poor villages, objectively, but they apparently are really self-managed, as far as I could tell. And so we walked into this village, and it happened that there was a village council meeting going on. There's a kind of a council that's making plans and so on. And it was drawn from people of all classes. There didn't seem to be any caste. So one of the people in the council was a tribal woman, for example, which is kind of like almost unheard of. Another one was a poor fisherman, and there were others, and there was a lively discussion. It was translated for me. And then afterwards, a couple of them just took us on a walk through the village, and there were some pretty interesting things. For example, we passed by a building, and I asked what it was, and the guy from the village didn't even know what it was. But when we looked into it, it turns out it was a cooperative run by women, a milk cooperative. Apparently, they brought together their family cows or however it works, and they had set up a milk cooperative which was providing a good bit of the village milk. If you go to through the village, you go to places where people are living, it turned out that several families had gotten together with government aid, incidentally, to build wells. There's no water in the village, of course, but they had gotten fairly primitive technology with government assistance, communist government, so that women who do most of the things were able to get together and say 3 or 4 families and dig a well. And they showed us very proudly how you do it. You build your own well, and so on and so forth. So the couple of families had water and went to a school. Practically nothing except kids were sitting there learning. But then, just to get back to the Naxalites, as we were walking through, there was a kind of a big mansion that was sort of burned down, and I asked, "What's that?" And there was a little shuffling of feet and discomfort, and finally they said, "Well, that's where the landlord lived, and we killed him and burned down his house and drove him out." And so that's the Naxalite revolution. So I'm sure, this is one experience. I don't draw a lot from it, but I think that's probably true right through the region. And it led to substantial land reform and some big changes. It's now reversing. In part, it's reversing because of efforts of the so-called communist government, which incidentally was super Stalinist, unbelievably Stalinist, to take over, to drive out rural people and take over resources and bring in foreign investment. Foreign here, incidentally, means Indian investment, like a Tata automobile plant and things like that. And it's a complicated country. I don't think it's easy to capture. There's some very interesting study. There's one interesting study of West Bengal by a very good economist, a British economist, Barbara Harris White is her name, who's worked extensively in West Bengal. And I forget what her book is called, but her estimate is that about 80% of the economy is black, meaning, informal economy. That's a huge amount, and that very ugly figures about poverty and so on, which you just can't miss in India. I've never seen a place, I've been in a lot of horrible places, but I've never seen a place where poverty is both so horrible to look at, but so ubiquitous. You take a city like Delhi, which is a modern city, you can't drive through the city without seeing horrible things all over. Actually, just another personal experience. Last time I was there, I was going to a demonstration. We were going to have a demonstration about, I don't know what, I forget what, war in Afghanistan or something, but I was being driven there, and I was with a woman, Arundhati Roy, do you know her? Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is a fantastic woman. She was a sociologist at Nehru University, but she left the university, and she went to Rajasthan, a very poor area, and for 17 years she'd been living in an extremely poor village in Rajasthan, working on women's issues. Really dedicated person, living in horrible conditions and so on. Anyhow, she was sitting next to me in the car, and if the car stops at a corner, you're immediately surrounded, especially if they see some white person in there, you're immediately surrounded by beggars. A gypsy woman holding a starving child and all kind of horrible scenes. And I was trying to give the beggars a rupee or something, just like a penny, and she told me not to. She said, "You can't do it, because if you do, you just bring in a whole mass of people." But I noticed as we were driving, she never even looked. She couldn't look out the window to see the misery outside. And I asked her about it. And she said, "Look, you can't survive if you look. You have to be able to steel yourself not to see what's right outside the window. Otherwise you can't survive in this society." And this is a woman who is really dedicated. And I think that's true of India. Don't know if you agree, but that's my impression of it. This country has enormous problems.
For any questions on the Mideast, please keep in mind that Noam will be talking about that tonight extensively.
Thanks for letting me know. I didn't know what I was talking about.
In back, and then there, and then there. You that's looking back, the floor's back. Sorry, I don't have your name.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So there's obviously a million things going wrong in the world, and at certain times, strategy works best working around issues of race or women's issues or ecology. Do you see a strategic, what do you see as the best strategic focus for radicalizing people in the U.S.?
I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I mean, let's just go back to this group in South Boston that I learned about, Vita Urbana. For them, the serious issues to work on are having a traffic light on a corner, or having some way for kids to stay in school and have a reasonable experience, or some way to get jobs for poor people, to break through the racial barriers and so on. Okay, that's the immediate problems for them. For people living in the Rust Belt of the United States, upper Midwest, where the industrial system is being closed down, the immediate problem is to find a decent existence, probably by taking over the factories and running them themselves, and carrying out a real industrial revolution with green technology and so on. For other people, it's somehow dealing with the fact that we're facing an environmental crisis that could destroy the species. There's just too many examples. Depends who you are, where you're working, what you can do, what your talents are, what your commitments are. No shortage of. I don't think you can rank these things, and there's no. I can't imagine there's one answer, and they all kind of, they're all in parallel and interact. I mean, each one strengthens the others.
Noam, you usually point out that the villain in the piece between the have and the have-nots are the corporations. The corporations are the problem, top down, and so the way you have suggested to fix the situation, which I find interesting and exciting and usually not discussed, is you point out that the corporations are granted by the public charter, and that if the public gets together and wanted to, they could pull the charter of Exxon or Boeing or whoever. So tell us, should we make up a list of the most exploitive corporations, and should we then organize to pull their corporate charters? I mean, that's exciting.
It's a technical possibility. If you take a look at the corporations, let's say Exxon, every one is something like Standard Oil of California or of New Jersey or something else. And the reason is because they have state charters.
Right.
That's the way a corporation is established. Corporation is an entity established by state power, primarily federal power, but within the jurisdiction of a state, where they're given a charter. And if you look at the history of corporations, say through the you go back to say 1900 or something, 1800, a corporation was just a group of people who got together, and say a municipality that got together and decided we want to build a bridge over this river or something, and they incorporated and were given a charter by the state to build a bridge over the river, and once they built the bridge, it was the end of it. That was what a corporation was. Through the 19th century, mostly the courts, it wasn't really legislation, the courts gradually extended the rights and privileges of corporations. Finally, by about a century ago, they were given extraordinary privileges, mostly by lawyers, legal authorities, court decisions, and so on. But they're still chartered by states. I mean, the reason that there are so many that are incorporated in New Jersey and Delaware is that by the late 19th century, the courts had decided that corporations didn't have to have a fixed purpose, and they could buy into other corporations, and they were given all sorts of other
The rights of
gifts.
persons.
Yeah, all kind of, well, that came later. That was the early 19th century. Yeah, they got the rights of persons, then beyond the rights of persons and so on. But as all of this took place, some states, like New Jersey and Delaware in particular, realized that they could make a killing just in corporate taxes by getting the corporations to move their offices there. So move them out of New York and across the river, and you get a lot of extra benefits. So you get Standard Oil of New Jersey and a ton of corporations in Delaware. They're kind of a race to the bottom. The fact that there were states competing to get tax profits and other, just employment and so on, led to a kind of race to the bottom, which is still going on, incidentally. So take, say, Massachusetts. One of the big employers here is Fidelity, big financial institution. The state gives them all kind of gifts, but Rhode Island's now giving them bigger gifts. So they're going to move over the border to Rhode Island, which means losing tens of thousands of jobs here. Other corporations are, I forget the name of it, but one green technology corporation was just given a very substantial taxpayer gifts in Massachusetts, but they decided to pack up and move to China, where it's cheaper and workers can be gotten.
Evergreen Solar.
What was it?
Evergreen Solar?
Yeah, Evergreen, right. So that goes, now it's international, but it used to be in the States, but they still have state charters, which means that in principle the citizens of the state can take away the charter. But there are even less radical moves that can be made, which could be significant. I mean, you can take a look at standard economics textbooks, the kind that you read in graduate courses in economics on corporations, which point out that it's just a court decision, which isn't written in stone, that corporation management has to be answerable to stockholders. I mean, part of Anglo-American corporate law, just established by the courts, no legislation, is that the managers of a corporation must dedicate themselves to shareholder profit. That's a lethal principle. That's the kind of principle that's going to destroy the environment and everything else for all kind of reasons. So it's a really lethal principle. But it's just a court decision, can be overturned. And as the textbooks point out, you could change corporate law so that corporations are responsible to what are called stakeholders. Stakeholders means the workforce and the community. That their legal responsibility is for the benefit of the workforce and the community. There's nothing in economic principle that tells you can't do that. It's just a court decision that you can't do it. Well, that's a pretty straightforward move. I think it probably have enormous popular support, and it's even short of taking away the charter, which is another step. So there's plenty of anti-corporate moves that could be made, and they're kind of like right on the surface, like most things about human affairs. It's a matter of getting over this kind of barrier of not seeing what's around us. Kind of like the Galilean revolution. You got to see what's around you before, when you do, you find lots of steps can be taken. There are small efforts to do this on a national scale. There's one organization called, I forget what it stands for, POCLAD, P-O-C-L-A-D. Anybody remember? You can find it on the internet.
P-O-C-L-A-D?
Yeah, it's it's not a lot of people, but it's a small number. I think it's organized by a guy named Richard Grossman, if I remember, it has a lot of publications, which are pretty sensible ones on questions of this kind. Does some organizing. There are actually parts of the country, like some area in rural Pennsylvania, I think, which has just rejected all corporations, says you can't come in.
The democracy schools movement. Democracy schools, it's the people in Pennsylvania. They call it the democracy schools, the people in Pennsylvania. Democracy schools. They call it democracy schools. The people in Pennsylvania, they call them democracy schools. They go into a community and they organise on a local level and annul corporate charters in that community.
Are just not applicable there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like areas of the country like Cape Cod, for example, which parts of Cape Cod which don't allow you know, any of the international enterprises in McDonald's, Dunkin' Donuts, and so on. So plenty of things like this can be done at a local level and beyond. They're well within the range of popular organizing.
And easier than trying to revoke the charter.
Revoking the charter would require a significant educational campaign, which is at least statewide. And it would, of course, come up against fantastic business opposition. You know, I mean, try to make any slight change, you immediately get caught up in massive business propaganda about you're going to lose your job, it's going to destroy the economy, and so on. So you got to be prepared for that. And that takes real, you know, real popular roots and organization before you can try to do that. Sounds simple, but you know, when you think about the power structures, it's not simple.
You had a question, and then did somebody?
Yeah, I think it might be me.
You, then you in the back, and then you.
How do you see climate change refugees and other
climate change
refugees from like rising waters and other displaced people because of natural disasters affecting the U.S. climate issue or U.S. migration issues?
I mean, there are sooner or later going to be large-scale population movements caused by climate change. Some of them will be massive. Like take, say, Bangladesh. Large parts of Bangladesh should just be inundated if the oceans rise a little bit. And that's hundreds of millions of people. But even short of that, you know, islands are getting inundated. Coastlines are disappearing. And there's droughts. I mean, take, say, Africa. There's droughts all over the place. Those are effects substantially of climate change. Actually, a lot of what's going on in Darfur is the result of climate change, which is taking away the natural environment of nomadic groups. So they're encroaching in agricultural areas because they can't survive otherwise, and that's leading to conflict and to the violence that we talk about and so on. So it's happening right in front of our eyes, and it's going to get much worse. Nobody knows how much, but it could be really pretty bad. I mean, we've got to do something. The sensible attitude is to try to prevent it. But if it happens, it could be pretty monstrous. I mean, Darfur is an example where it's leading to significant war.
Sorry, do you see that affecting the American migration issues?
Probably not, because of just geographical reasons. I mean, the only way to get to the United States is from the south. And it's, I mean, if you look at places like, say, Guatemala, which I mentioned, I mean, there are climate areas there which are driving people to the north, but it's going to be, there's no way to get from Africa to the United States, you know, in any large-scale manner. I mean, they'll go to Europe, not the United States. Now, probably if you read, say, the Wall Street Journal, their line is, well, you know, global warming is not a big deal, you know, it'd be pretty good for the United States. Well, maybe, you know, so you have palm trees in Chicago and so on, but it doesn't seem a very bright idea, but it's possible that the temperate regions may not themselves suffer too much. And for Greenland, who knows, maybe it'll be a vacation resort. Of course, on the other hand, as soon as the permafrost starts to melt in large areas of Siberia and elsewhere, the predictions are you're going to get a very quick release of methane. Methane is far more destructive to the environment than carbon dioxide. So we may just kiss each other goodbye at that point.
You had a question in the back?
Wow.
On that note, you mentioned earlier that to remind you to discuss the history of NAFTA and other...
I can't hear.
You mentioned earlier to remind you to discuss the history of NAFTA and some effects, the history of Mexico relating to immigration.
Pre-NAFTA Mexico. Well, that's actually an interesting and pretty revealing story. I mean, go back a little bit. In the 1970s, the World Bank and the U.S. Treasury Department and the IMF, which is all kind of a complex, the theory that they were working with was that third world countries, which means third world dictators, should take on huge debts. And U.S. banks and other banks should lend them huge amounts of money because some crazed economic theory said, it's the great thing to do. So that was the policy, and they listened. Third world dictators are happy to take on big debts and spend the money on whatever they spend it on. Not for the good of the population, but they did it. Finally, around 1980, the U.S. was in an inflationary period, and first Carter and then Reagan picked Paul Volcker, who's now famous in the regulatory debates, to become Secretary of Treasury, and he sharply raised interest rates to try to wipe inflation out of the economy. Well, that caused here the worst recession since the 1930s. But in the third world, it was just like a devastating. I would say take Mexico. They had floating interest rates, so their debts were indexed to U.S. interest rates. So when U.S. interest rates shot up, their debt payments shot up, and they couldn't pay it. So Mexico, by 1982 or so, was facing default. The economy they couldn't pay their debts. Well, nobody cares that much about Mexico, but you care a lot about U.S. banks. For example, what is now Citigroup, at that time was Citibank, major U.S. bank that goes way back. Their debt obligations were greater than their capital. They were in real trouble. Well, when a capitalist institution, a private institution, gets in trouble, you call upon the state to bail you out, meaning the citizens. That's the way the system works. It's not a capitalist system. You rely on the state to bail you out if you're in trouble. So the state agency that was used to take care of this is called the IMF, which is basically a branch of the U.S. Treasury Department. So the IMF imposed on Mexico very harsh structural adjustment programs. Without going into the details, what a structural adjustment program means is that the poor people in the country pay off the debts incurred by the rich people in the country. It's radically anti-capitalist. Like, for example, if I lend you money, right, and I know it's a risky loan, so I get very high interest and I get plenty of profit, and then at some point you can't pay the loan, it's my problem in a capitalist economy, but not in our economy. In our economy, the way it's done is that your neighbors pay off the loan, and the IMF makes sure that they do. That's called structural adjustment. Okay, radically anti-capitalist, but it's the way power works. So Mexico, the poor in Mexico were forced to pay off the loans taken by the dictators. And the same throughout much of the world. Well, Citibank was saved thanks to massive state intervention. The director of Citibank, Walter Wriston, was a passionate advocate of the free market, as was the Treasury Secretary, William Simon. A lot of, elevated rhetoric about free markets, but not when it comes to saving the rich. As soon as it comes from saving the rich, forget about free markets. The taxpayer moves in and pays them off in the north, and the poor in the south pay them off. So Citibank was rescued, went on to new atrocities like its major role in the last financial crisis, for which it got bailed out again, of course, the way the really existing capitalism works. Okay, Mexico had a decade of severe decline, mostly the poor. Also plenty of atrocities, a stolen election, state violence, and all kind of horrors. Around 1990, there was a strategy conference called in Washington. It's called a Latin American Strategy Conference. And a lot of experts and political figures and businessmen and so on met to review relationships with Latin America. Well, with regard to Mexico, They said relationships are just fine, everything's great, stolen election, poor people starving to death, state atrocities, but everything's just great. But they said there's one cloud on the horizon, a possible democracy opening. That's what they called it. There might be a democracy opening in Mexico which would threaten the reforms. The reforms are the neoliberal programs that were destroying the economy. So that's a problem. I mean, it's hard to overestimate the extent to which democracy is feared and hated by elites. I mean, it's overwhelming, and for good reasons. If you're in a position of power, there's nothing you hate more than democracy. I mean, you talk about how wonderful it is, but it's really passionate fear and hatred, understandably. So there might be a democracy opening in Mexico which would threaten the reforms. So what's the natural thing to do? Well, the natural thing to do, and you can read about it in the business press, is to lock Mexico into the reforms by treaty. Treaties are hard to break. So let's have a treaty which will lock Mexico into the reforms. Perfectly public, you can read it in the business press. And that was done. That's called NAFTA. Okay, so NAFTA was an effort to lock Mexico into the reforms, which had devastated the economy for the public, but was really good for the rich. I mean, kind of like India, the number of billionaires shooting up very fast. In fact, one of them, Carlos Slim, one of the biggest crooks in the world, is now the richest person in the world. This year he passed Bill Gates. So, that's the reforms that we had to lock Mexico into by treaty, NAFTA. And as I said before, the consequence of locking Mexico into the reforms is the economy will be even further devastated.
They bailed out Goldman Sachs by doing that.
Pardon?
That's how they bailed out Goldman Sachs.
Yeah, Goldman Sachs, but it's just standard. It's standard. The Citigroup is a particularly interesting example because it goes way back. So now we get the, you get the wall and you get the immigration crisis and so on. I mean, it all ties together. That ought to be the kind of thing that people should study in 6th grade. It's pretty obvious. I mean, there's nothing very profound about this. And the history is very straight, it's very logical. And it's the natural way in which a state capitalist economy would function.
We're going to have to wrap it up. Next scheduled workshops begin at 4, and so that's all for now. Please give Noam
mentioned Vida Urbana, and it's an organization in Boston that I do some work with. It's called City Life Vida Urbana, and you can look it up on the internet, clvu.org. And they have a really smart organizer there named Steve Meacham, and I interviewed him precisely because he's doing this work that, people are, a lot of questions here were sort of asking about how do you do, what's a strategy for how to do revolutionary work in the current context. And so there's an interview that was in Z Magazine, and I think you can probably find it on the Z Mag website. So I just encourage you to look it up if you want more detail on that model. It's a model you can replicate anywhere. And so, yeah.
Can you say the name again?
City Life.
Yeah, but the person.
Steve Meacham, M-E-A-C-H-A-M.
Okay. Probably online, look up Cynthia.
Yeah, either me or him, or put us together in the search.
Okay. There's a YouTube video too.
There's a great YouTube video. Look him up on YouTube.
There's a really interesting document. You probably see it. It's really. I can't remember. It's Madrid before Hanita. Madrid before Hanita. And it's a story of the people in Israel in the 20s, like socialists and anarchists in Israel, who went volunteering for the Spanish Civil War. And it's made in the early 90s, and there were lots and lots of interviews from people who actually were those volunteers, because they were still living as volunteers.
That's going to determine what the most basic were.
What's that?
I wish I had something more important to ask you. I know she'd be really happy
I don't know if you've ever heard Sons of Arundhati.